Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Joining us to discuss coverage of the presidential election is award-winning journalist Martin Tolchin, who capped a 40-year career with the New York Times by founding the Hill newspaper. He then moved on to help launch Politico. Marty, this whole concept of retirement, I think you need to work on it.
No, I flunked it several times. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us. We're glad you're still active and that the retirement was a false alarm, so to speak.
Let me ask you, we were talking before we began recording this discussion, and you said that the Carter-Reagan race was the first presidential election that you covered. Over the years and over the span of elections that you've now seen, let's do a little comparison and contrast. What has changed most significantly, for better or for worse?
Well, I think, John, politics has always been a blood sport. You can go back to the founding fathers, and they killed each other with slurs, with all kinds of distortions. But I think it's fair to say that the acrimony and distortions of this presidential campaign stand out.
In the entire history of the country, or just in modern presidential?
In modern presidential history. In modern presidential. But it's always been, you know, Abe Lincoln was lampooned as an ape. They've all suffered grievously. You've got to have a thick skin to be in politics.
That's an important point you're making here, though. I think most people always act as if everything was civilized and polite, and that somehow it's now become harsh and degraded. But as far back as you can go, the first contested election, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, charges of loyalties to France and a desire to become a monarch.
Right, exactly. And I think it's the same thing on Capitol Hill. You know, actually in Capitol Hill, I think, if anything, it's gotten better, because when I came here, Congress was dominated by the Southern Bourbons, who were, for the most part, segregationists and reactionaries, and they controlled Congress very tightly, and it was worth a new senator or a new House member's career to cross them. Now they cross them with impunity. So what we have perhaps lost in civility, we've gained in democracy, because they're no longer, first of all, the Southern Bourbons no longer have the tight control that they did. Leadership is far more dispersed on the Hill. And second of all, you know, they no longer control your career. They no longer.
One change that people do point to, though, is how ideology has become so important in a way where you used to have the compromisers, people who understood that was part of the job, and they couldn't always get their way 100%. And now we've seen almost this ideological purity where you won't bend unless you get your way 100%.
Well, some people attribute this to the McGovern reforms, the George McGovern reforms. Democratic Party, which had a selection of presidential candidates in primaries instead of being selected by party bosses. And in primaries, of course, the extremists, both left and right, who are the most determined, very often prevail. And so
Are you saying bring back the smoke-filled rooms where the political bosses pick the candidates?
I'm saying smoke-filled rooms weren't all bad. Look who they picked: FDR, Kennedy, Johnson. Look who they picked. They didn't do that badly.
Another corrective people point to in the formula you just described is that if there were higher voter turnout in primaries, candidates wouldn't have to be so extreme to survive the primary process. Do you have any magic solution of how we get more people involved?
No.
It's an age-old question I thought I'd ask.
And I can't imagine why people don't get involved, because this is your life.
Yeah.
I mean, these people can send you off to war. These people can send you to prison. These people can ruin your business. These people can make your business. These people, you know, the political arena is an extraordinarily potent force, and how people can just sit out a presidential primary or a presidential election is very hard for me to understand.
Where does that come from for somebody like you? Was that part of your orientation as a child? Did you see your parents participate?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess that goes back to, I mean, if it doesn't happen at an early age, it's probably an uphill climb.
Yeah.
What the amount of coverage has certainly increased. Just the 24/7 news channels alone.
Absolutely.
Has the quality increased?
I think I like the increased coverage, because it used to be that that the big media really controlled coverage, and they could keep secrets. They had their pets. They could do whatever they wanted to do and withhold stories, and nobody would be any the wiser. Today, you can't do that anymore. Newsweek had the Lewinsky story, decided not to publish it. Drudge published it on the net. So what you have is a multiplicity of factors. And I was thinking, a year ago, last October, there was one day when the NBC News led with coverage of 3 Occupy Wall Street demonstrations in which there was police violence of one sort or another. One demonstration in one city, a veteran of the Iraq War was hit with a shell that came off, skull was fractured. In New York City, Occupy Wall Street demonstrators were gassed, and they were very peaceful demonstrators, gassed by New York City police. And there was a third one. And all of those 3 videos were taken with cell phone cameras on the NBC Nightly News. So what you now have is any cop who manhandles a prisoner in public has to reckon with possibly being on the nightly news. And I think that's great. I like a multiplicity of voices.
It's so refreshing to hear, especially a veteran news person.
Yeah.
I'm sure you heard from some of your colleagues, can be very cranky about what's happened to the environment, where the sense of who's a reporter now has expanded to just about anybody with a digital device.
Exactly right. Well, The Hill and Politico, both desktop publishing. Mm-hmm. You don't need to be a zillionaire anymore. You don't need to be a William Randolph Hearst or a McCormick or even a Sulzberger.
You don't have to buy a satellite dish. You just need to buy a cell phone.
Right.
Well, Mitt Romney and the 47%.
Right.
These moments. Now, do candidates now have to just assume they're always on?
Absolutely. And they always should. And they always should assume that. But I really do like the multiplicity of input. The fact that if something is going on that's really important, the likelihood it's going to come out. Mm-hmm. I like that. Now, what has suffered is the vetting of articles. They do not go through the process that the New York Times has for publishing articles.
Is the New York Times process still the process it was when you worked with the Times?
It still is. It still is. When I was in the Washington Bureau, our stories were edited by about 7 editors, 3 in Washington, 4 in New York. But then, as now, you have to read critically. If something seems unlikely to you, consider the source, and you have to read everything with a grain of salt.
What is your opinion of this fact-checking movement that has emerged, PolitiFact and factcheck.org and all the various entities? One of the criticisms is that they sort of treat everything equal, and so a major lie is given the same equivalency as a minor fib, and so that they may not exactly achieve what they're trying to achieve. What are your thoughts?
Well, there are, in this campaign, there have been distortions actually on both sides. When Romney charged that President Obama had destroyed welfare by not requiring people on welfare to go to work, that was false. It was denounced as false. The ads continued. Conversely, when the Obama folks put out an ad about a woman who died because her husband's plant, which was owned by Bain, which was owned by Romney, had closed, and her family no longer had health insurance, and therefore she died. That was false because the plant closed 5 years before she got sick. And in both cases, even though it was pointed out universally, the ads continued.
Well,
it's as if nobody cares.
This has certainly gotten a lot of play. Neil Newhouse, the Romney pollster. We're not going to let our campaigns be dictated by fact checkers. They certainly have delivered on that promise.
They have indeed. they have indeed. That's candid.
It's always nice to see somebody be so blatantly honest. In the debates, you mentioned this loose playing with reality. Candy Crowley attempted to be an on-the-spot fact checker.
Right.
What did you think of that? Is that a proper role for the moderator?
I like that. Yes, I did.
Would you like to see more of that?
I would. I would. I think, she's gotten some criticism for doing that. I would also like to see a little more deference for the moderator, which
from the candidates.
From the candidates during the debate.
Yeah, it's really vexing in that they agree to the rules, and then almost from the start of the debate, they begin to trample the rules.
Yeah, and the second presidential debate, the rule was no questioning of the other candidate, and right off the bat, actually Romney was the far worse offender.
But on the other hand, Kathleen Hall Jamieson from the University of Pennsylvania has pointed out that the debates are one of the only forums left standing within a election where we see two-sided information, where it's not just one side with its pre-planned message.
I think that, first of all, it's great entertainment. It held me absolutely, I was rapt. I couldn't take my eyes off that screen. And second of all, I think they've been quite substantive. I think when you take away all the gook, you really get a very good feeling about what these people are all about, both policy-wise and character-wise. I think we know pretty well what President Obama is like and what he, everybody says he hasn't presented a vision. I think he has presented a vision. You know exactly what he wants to do. He wants to put money in infrastructure. He wants to put money in healthcare. You know exactly what he wants to do.
Maybe the people who say that really don't like the vision. It's not that he hasn't expressed one.
That's something else, and they're certainly entitled. But you see their visions, really, and you also see their character. You see how they treat the other person, how they treat the moderator. And I think it's very enlightening.
This is a very personal choice for Americans. Even to hear you talk about it, a reporter, a professional, someone who analyzes these things in depth, still you're talking about the personal characteristics.
Yeah. Yes, I think personal characteristics are important.
The press has often been depicted as a kingmaker or a career destroyer. First of all, that's probably never been as true as it's been stated, but has the influence or the impact of the press's coverage on the outcome increased or decreased?
I think it's probably decreased because, if the press were a kingmaker, most reporters are liberal. They never would have elected George W. Bush. They never would have elected a whole lot of people. So I don't think their influence is as great as people think.
Has it always been overstated? Or was there a time when it was more significant?
There was a time, I think, in the last century, in the first half of the last century, where, Mr. Hearst's War, et cetera, Spanish-American War, where I think the press had more power in the political arena.
Chris Lehane, who was Al Gore's 2000 campaign press secretary, said in the past, the press effectively played the role of umpire. Now they are effectively in the bleachers. He's suggesting that what you described earlier, this democratization where information sources come at us from all different places and not just official sources, has relegated the press to a bleacher position.
Well, I think that's overstating it. I think that's overstating it, because the press can deliver a body blow, and the press can make a candidate. But it takes a lot of things happening at the same time. It takes a convergence of a lot of things, and I don't see it happening in modern campaigns.
The use of polls as essentially news, not just as a supplement to the news. A poll will lead. What do you think about that? There's been people who have been very critical, saying a poll is not news, and it's only a snapshot, not even of the future, of the past.
That's right.
Is it overused?
I think it is overused. I think it is overused.
Is this a new development?
No, I don't think it's. I think since polling began, it's been overused, and sometimes polling has been extremely accurate in forecasting the vote, and sometimes it's been wildly inaccurate. And it really depends on the polling institution, their process, and people do change. Voters do change. Voters change at the last minute.
If you were media king for a day, how would you use polls? Would it ever be the headline on the New York Times?
No,
poll?
I would use them to inform reporting.
Inform reporting.
Reform reporting. I would use them if people are concerned about, let's say, immigration, to do more stories about why and what their concerns are, et cetera. I would use them more to inform reporting than as just it's out there.
Let me ask you about the cost of doing business, and you'll like this because I will not too subtly plug your book, Pinstripe Patronage.
Great.
That you wrote with your wife, and our regards to Sue out there. Hopefully, we hope she's watching. The costs continue to escalate.
Yes.
What can you say about the cost of running for president?
Well,
in
the cost of
2012?
running for president now is apparently $1 billion for each campaign. Of course, Obama was the first candidate not to use the presidential
the public monies.
The public monies, because he could raise so much more than McCain. But in one sense, it's really good for the media, because it gives TV and radio and print organizations a lot of money. I mean, it really funnels.
Broadcasters hate this question, but should they be giving free time to campaigns so that it doesn't create this insatiable need to buy multi-million-dollar ad
I think
campaigns?
absolutely, absolutely. You should be able to know, if you're a conscientious watcher or listener to radio, you should be able to know the policies of candidates without them having to buy time. But they don't buy time really to tell their policies. They buy time lately for character assassination.
Everybody says they hate negative campaign ads, but every producer of campaign ads tell me the reason they keep making them is because they work.
They're very, very effective, and you always know who the losing candidate is, because immediately they'll go to negative campaigning, big time.
Final thought, and a very brief time to get you to respond to a big question, is where's the news business headed? As you and I were talking before today, this is the day that Newsweek announced it would no longer have a print edition. We continue to see the demise of print. Where's it all headed?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist. The New York Times has turned around now that it's charging for its online edition, has 500,000 subscribers. And people who purchase the print edition get the online edition without charge. Several news organizations are doing that. I think the best of the print media will survive, and I think the rest will go online. And I don't think that's a terrible thing.
Marty, as always, a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great being here.
This October marks the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we'll provide context in just a moment.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
The world was on the brink of nuclear war 50 years ago this month. Cooler heads prevailed, and newly released documents are shedding light on exactly how the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't end with a bang. Former director of the Nixon Presidential Library, Timothy Naftali, currently a National Security Fellow at the New America Foundation, is the featured guest in this week's edition of Context. As newly available documents provide more information on what happened, is the story of the missile crisis changing?
The iconic story is we were eyeball to eyeball and the other guy blinked. In terms of the story today, there's been a fundamental shift in how we look at it. First of all, yes, we were eyeball to eyeball, but both sides conceded to end this crisis successfully. That's one big change. And the second big change is there were more than two eyeballs. There were lots of players in this game, and not all of them were willing to show the kind of judgment and prudence that Khrushchev and Kennedy showed. So the crisis, from the perspective of the two leaders, was one of negotiated settlement. From the perspective of the players on the ground, it was an uncontrollable series of accidents waiting to happen.
How different does the story look from the Cuban and Soviet perspectives?
Well, the Cubans emerged from this crisis very angry. They feel that the crisis was started and managed over their heads. And Castro, in order to regain some credibility and respect and to send a message to the Soviets, laid out 5 conditions. One of the things he wouldn't allow was on-site inspection, which was something that Khrushchev had promised Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy said, I want to be absolutely certain you're taking those missiles out. Castro said, there's no way. Our sovereignty has been violated enough by the United States. We're not going to let it happen again. So from the Cuban perspective, this crisis produced anger and surprise at how the Soviets had taken them for granted. From the Soviet perspective, Khrushchev did obtain a good concession at the end. Actually, 2 concessions. One that was very public, and that was the American guarantee not to invade Cuba, and the other was a private concession that John F. Kennedy, through his brother, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, had given the Soviets, and that was to remove, within 3 to 4 months, the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey. From Khrushchev's perspective, this was a reasonable outcome. Among his colleagues, most of whom had been against this whole idea in the first place, there was a mounting resentment. And in fact, they brought, as an example of Khrushchev's recklessness, they cited the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years later when they threw him out. So I think that the Kremlin is divided on the lessons it learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and certainly divided in its understanding of whether it was a success or a failure. One of the things the Soviets took out of this crisis was, we can't be strategically inferior to the Americans any longer. We're just going to have to keep building missiles until we're not only equal with them, but superior to them in strategic power. And that's what they did, and they would achieve that in the 70s.
For President Kennedy, was the crisis more political or strategic?
For Kennedy, it was more of a political issue, and it was a political issue because he had drawn a red line. He had told the American people that the United States government would not countenance the placement of what he called offensive weapons, but which all Americans understood to mean strategic missiles, on Cuba by the Soviet Union. He had said it publicly in early September 1962. So when it turned out that the Soviets were doing that, he had no choice but to force them to remove those missiles. I mean, his credibility was on the line. Now, I will say, as an aside, I think he drew that red line because he assumed the Soviets would never put missiles in Cuba. One, he had actually asked the Soviets, using the back channel, whether they would do it, and the Soviets said, of course we wouldn't do that. 2, he assumed, well, if they're thinking of it, my going public about it is going to deter them from doing it. So when he was surprised and found out that indeed the Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba, he felt he had no choice. Indeed, in a private conversation with his brother, which was recorded on tape, his brother RFK, and he discussed the fact that he would probably be impeached if he didn't do something about the missiles in Cuba. In terms of the strategic effect that the missiles, the Americans were ahead, the missiles did not change that. Yes, they cut the warning time that an American president might have before a nuclear war, but when you get to the point where the other side's launching weapons, the game's over anyway, in the sense that Kennedy did not want nuclear war and neither did Khrushchev.
What was the one factor above all others that enabled us to avoid nuclear catastrophe?
Leadership, because Khrushchev decides when he hears the Kennedy make his speech, and Kennedy says we're going to put a quarantine, really a blockade. That moment, that is within moments, I mean, that night, Khrushchev decides to try to reduce the threat of war. He starts turning around ships, or holding them actually, away from Cuba. And so from the very beginning, Khrushchev is thinking, I don't want war. And then within a couple of days, he's already telling the leadership, the Soviet leadership, you know, if we could get Kennedy to promise not to invade Cuba, I think that would be reason enough for us to remove the missiles. So on the Soviet side, they were not willing to risk war. In fact, I don't believe they ever assumed they were risking war by putting missiles in Cuba. On the American side, the very fact that Kennedy did not act on his initial passion to use military force to wipe the slate clean, if you will, to get rid of the missiles they had seen, the fact that he controlled that passion, which is understandable given the fact he'd been lied to by the Soviets, that was leadership too.
New editions of Context can be found each week at wilsoncenter.org/context. That's all for this week's edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.